Hi, my name is David Frerichs, and I'm with Amazon. And today I have the privilege of talking to you about designing for accessibility. The idea that it's not only good practice, that is to say, the right thing to do, but it's also good business. So I'm going to walk you through some examples of what accessibility design means, how to do it, and then show you some ways that it has been done in the context of our Alexa product. But before I jump into that, I want to give you a little bit of background about me so you know where I'm coming from when I share this topic with you. I've been with Amazon since 2017. And before then, I had a background in music technology and business virtual reality, as well as in white label voice agents. So the idea of doing something like Alexa, but having its own private label brand. But since then, I've been at Amazon, and at Amazon, I've had the privilege to work on some interesting technologies, working on things like multi-room music, doing smart home over Alexa voice service, and then also doing some innovative use cases, particularly one I'm going to talk about in more detail, something like voice in and text out response. And more recently, I've been in our Alexa for Everyone group, working on the needs of customers who are in the aging and accessibility segments. But if you look back through that time, there's one theme that will come through. And that theme has been that I've always wanted to be able to use the power and flexibility of computing platforms to adapt those information experiences, those information machines, to the needs of people. Too often, we think about people needing to learn how to use a system or learn how to use a computer. And my insight here, and the thing that I've been continually trying to do, is to use the power of the machine to flex itself to the needs of the actual customer in a way that makes it so the experience is not only engaging but also intuitive. But to kind of one of the right ways to do a talk, I think, is to make sure that people understand exactly the most salient points that you're trying to share right up front. So I will begin my talk with the conclusion. And the conclusion of my talk is very, very simple, that if you take nothing else away from this talk, these are the things that would be most helpful, I think. The first is that removing barriers, which is the definition of accessibility, increases access for everyone. It's not just solving for a niche, it's actually increasing the value of your product overall. The second thing is that you should be thinking about this and use inclusive design from the start. It's not something you want to bolt on at the end, it's something you want to do from the beginning. And when you're doing that from the beginning, you actually can do that through a very simple method. The simple method is to focus on the needs of one specific customer, an actual human being that you understand and know very well. Solve their needs, make sure that that person can use your product really, really well, and then build out from there. And then finally, the place that we're at today in terms of accessibility is really in a lot of debt to the work that was done by early activists, at least from a perspective of here in the United States. Here I have a picture of Judith Heumann, who was a really important activist in the needs of the accessibility community, starting with people who have wheelchairs, and drove things that are in the United States, laws called Section 504 and the Americans with Disabilities Act, which we just had the 30th anniversary for this year. And so we owe a lot to these folks, and we should really pay attention to their contributions, because without their contributions, we wouldn't be where we are today in terms of accessibility. So I've talked a lot about it, but let's make sure we understand what we mean when we're talking about accessibility. I've used that word many, many times. So what is it? It's not catering to a minority. It's not something like, oh, here's this group of people over here, I'm going to go serve those people. No, that's that way of thinking about it creates a barrier to success. And more, very importantly, you're not solving a health problem. Yes, people with disabilities have a different way of functioning and a different level of functioning than people who don't have a disability. But if you view it as a health problem, then it creates a negative cycle in terms of the way that you're going to look at the issue. And then this is actually very, very important. This next point, when you're working on accessibility, it's not about dumbing down a product. Let's say the idea is that you're not taking a product and trying to remove features and simplify it so that that is actually something that somebody else could use. They can use. It's not for them. It's for everybody, because if you actually look at it not as dumbing down, but as making the product more usable to a broader set of people, you're not looking at somebody with a diminishing point of view, but you're looking to build people up. And this is a really important metric that you need to keep in mind as you're doing this design. And so, if it's not those things, what is it? And so, I said it at the beginning, accessibility is about removing barriers. And it's barriers that exclude people from any interaction. And if you consider accessibility in that way, the nature and scope of accessibility really broadens out, because barriers occur to everyone. There are all kinds of barriers. And so if you're working at removing those barriers, you're actually increasing the value of your product on a broad basis. And so that's a strong way to think about accessibility. And so if accessibility is about removing barriers, what kinds of barriers are there? And this model that I have here is something that I have borrowed from Microsoft in terms of their accessibility design lab. They have a really great set of resources. I think it's microsoft.com/accessibility or something similar to that. You could Google it and figure it out. But the idea here is that they represented three levels of accessibility. And what I've done here is add a fourth that I find really helpful. So you have permanent disabilities, you have temporary disabilities, you have situational disabilities, and then you have this other category, which I call preferential disabilities. And so a permanent disability is something that is always there. It's part of the person's essential nature, right? It's always there. Temporary is something that is affecting a person, but it's something that will eventually go away. Situational is affecting a person based on where they are or the environment that they're in. So it's not something that has to do with them, it has to do with their environment. And then preferential has to do with the idea of something that a way that I would rather do something, right? So a permanent disability would be that I cannot see, I'm blind, right? I'm permanently blind. That would be one kind of permanent disability. A temporary disability of a similar nature would be that I go to the eye doctor and the eye doctor puts some drops in my eye to dilate them, and suddenly I can't see very well, right? So that's another, it's a temporary one. So it'll go away, but it's a real disability that someone has in that moment. Situational, maybe there's a blackout situation, right? And that suddenly I can't see, right, because it's dark in my home or something like this, right? I have a situational disability. And then preferential is that I would want to be able to do this interaction without my eyes, right? So that's just a way that I would prefer to do it, because at that moment, whatever it is, that's just a way that I would rather do that interaction. So these are the types of barriers, and each one of them are valid barriers, and each one of them are types of barriers that you could address in the design of the product or system that you're creating. So we've talked about the types of barriers. Let's talk about the types of accessibility in the kind of the categories, the rough categories you can use to think about accessibility barriers. The first I already mentioned is visual, right? Things that have to do with your ability to see. That is very, very common. Another one, which is also very common, are auditory blocks. And again, these range the gamut from people who are deaf to people who have some kind of hearing loss, whether it's due to inherent or whether it's due to age. All of these things can happen. You have verbal disabilities, the inability for someone to speak, and for whatever reason. And that's something that ironically is important for us to think about in the context of a voice agent like Alexa, because obviously that's our primary modality of interaction. So it's something we need to really think about. There are also cognitive disabilities. That is to say that people have different levels of functioning. Their memory is different, or things along these lines. And so that's a set of barriers that can be addressed by a product also. And then a final one that I will share here is mobility disabilities. So people who are in a wheelchair for various reasons, or someone again who is aging and can't walk unassisted. Right? These are all mobility challenges. But all of these categories establish a base and way to think about your customers in such a way that you can actually then narrow in on solving a particular problem for that customer within that space. And so these are the types of interaction barriers that you might want to be able to try and approach and solve. Now, let's think about so we talked about, what does accessibility mean? We talked about the types of accessibility, but why is this important from a business point of view? Like, is there a business rationale why we should be paying attention to it? And the short answer is yes, yes, and yes. These accessibility issues have a broad impact on the community globally. Many of these numbers are centric to the United States, but percentage-wise, they map across the industrial world. So if you think about this first statistic, which when I heard it, really, really surprised me, and that is that 2.2 billion, with a B, people worldwide have some kind of vision impairment. That's huge. We need to be thinking about how we're going to be solving for the needs of those people. And then you look at in the United States specifically, you have 10% of all people who can't see, who have trouble seeing even with lenses, or they're actually blind, right? You look at worldwide hearing loss, so that's vision. Hearing loss is massive. 466 million people worldwide who have a disabling hearing loss. And again, this could be due to something that happened to them while they were young, or it could be due to aging, right? These are all sources of hearing loss. And then if you look at vocal, or the kinds of voice use, 18 million people in the United States. Think about it. You have let's say 270 million adults in the United States. A huge chunk of those people have some kind of problem using their voice in the past year. So we need to be thinking about how we can serve the needs of those people. And then a similar sized group of people have a difficulty walking even a quarter mile. A quarter mile is about, let's say, half a kilometer, right? You have somebody who has a challenge walking that level of distance. And so we need to be thinking about the needs of these people, because they're a massive audience. They're a massive customer base, and we need to serve those folks well. And so at the start of this conversation, I said that we should be starting with one customer. Well, what exactly does that mean? What it means is that it means what it says. You actually have a specific human being that ideally you know their name, that you've identified as someone that you're going to be able to fully understand their needs and be able to address their needs. This is key because it prevents a pitfall that often happens in product design, where we create, let's say, an idealized person, a person who we think exists but actually doesn't really exist. And so we may end up kind of partially solving the problem but not catching some important nuances. If you actually look at a specific person, then that person is somebody you can work with and actually then solve their needs. And the person here in the middle is someone that the folks on this call might recognize. That's Stephen Hawking. And that's actually a picture that I took when I was able to meet and give a presentation to Stephen Hawking when I worked at Silicon Graphics back in the 90s. And that was actually a big source of inspiration to me to see how he was able to take advantage of technology to interact with the world in a very, very effective way. And so I took a lot of inspiration from that. And so if we look at those categories of disability, and then we narrow it in to a particular kind of person, then that really helps us solve the needs. So if we look at motor, like I just said, instead of having a generic person, we have a man by the name of Stephen Hawking, 55, with ALS, and he does not have speech and he's confined to a wheelchair. Right? Those are high level attributes. Now, how am I going to adapt my product to serve his needs effectively? Continuing around the circle, if you think about somebody with a vision problem, you can narrow in on a particular woman. She's 78 years old and she suffers from macular degeneration, but otherwise has a very healthy and effective lifestyle. So what are we going to do to serve her needs? Or hearing. Now, we talked about people with permanent disabilities. Here's where it gets kind of interesting. What if I'm saying in hearing, I want to be able to allow a person with a situational disability, that is to say, a person at a crowded sporting event, I want to enable them to be able to interact with my product. How am I going to serve the needs of that person? So now you see this, maybe the subtlety of how picking a particular person in a particular situation can affect the way that you think about these challenges. Or verbal, another situational or maybe even preferential way of looking at it, which is you have a parent with a sleeping baby in the same room. Well, that person doesn't really probably want to use their voice because it's going to wake up the baby. So how are you going to be able to solve the needs of that person? Right? It's very, very specific here. Or cognitive, right? We look at somebody who is 27 years old and they're living with some kind of developmental disability and they're in a shared living home. So that situation creates, and that person's needs creates a very specific way of thinking about the criteria and design for your product. For example, in a shared living home, I've now got to think about authentication and multi-device use and all these other kinds of things that will come up that if I hadn't been so specific and just said, oh, I want to create a solution for people with cognitive disabilities, that's too generic. It's not going to get you where you need to be. You need to be very, very specific. And if you base it on the needs of a real person, then that means you're going to be addressing a real need, not a need that you think exists. Because no matter how empathetic we are, there's no way we, as somebody who does not have one of these disabilities, can fully appreciate all the challenges that someone will encounter in that situation. So if we put ourselves in that situation and we actually go and find somebody in that situation, then we're going to be able to have a really solid handle on that. And so let's look at, in the United States at least, and I know in other places, there's a canonical example, the primary example people use when they talk about accessibility, and that is curb cuts. That is the thing that I had at the first slide of this presentation, where you have a crosswalk across the street, and then you have a cut out where somebody can have a ramp access from the street to the sidewalk. And those were initially created. Actually, Judith Heumann was one of the people who really fought for those. That was one of her early activist works, and specifically for the idea of addressing the needs of people in wheelchairs. Before curb cuts, somebody in a wheelchair would have to go all the way down the street and maybe find a driveway, try to get up the driveway, dodge traffic until they could find a place to get back up on the sidewalk. It was very dangerous for those folks, let alone exhausting to try and get through there. And so curb cuts serve that needs. But okay, so that's the permanent. Now you look at the temporary need. Somebody, a parent with a stroller, someone with a stroller that needs to get up from the street back onto the curb. This use case has now become so core into curb cuts that in the UK, they're actually not called curb cuts, they're actually called pram cuts. So they actually have translated that specifically into this temporary need as opposed to the initial need that they were designed for, which was for the wheelchairs. And now, if we go up to a situational need, someone who is moving and they need to have a hand truck and they're going back and forth across the curb. If you didn't have that curb cut, going up and down would be very, very challenging. So, someone with a hand truck moving some goods, those cuts are really, really important for them. But here is the thing that I really am wanting you to internalize is that there's this other level called preferential. And it turns out that curb cuts also show the value of preferential access or preferential removal of barriers. There was a study done in the United States where people who are unencumbered, that is to say, somebody who is just walking, they're not carrying anything, they're just walking. 8 times out of 10, a person who is simply walking across the street will look and aim and go for the curb cut as opposed to not going for the curb cut. That is the power of a well-designed accessibility feature. Something that started for wheelchairs became embedded in society with strollers, something that values people who have a need that is temporary, like a hand truck, but now has become the preferred means for all people, unencumbered walkers. That is the power of a really well-designed accessibility feature, and something that we can all internalize and hopefully work to emulate. So if you map this then to the world where technology, if you talk about like higher technology, I guess, of course, curb cuts are a form of technology, so we got to be careful on that. But if you look at the idea of computing technologies, captions is something that we can look at as a specific use case here that we might want to address. So the first and most obvious one are people who are deaf or hard of hearing, right? They need to have some means of understanding what it is that is the coming out of the audio of the device if somebody is speaking. Captions, that is to say, the ability of putting the words of what's being spoken onto the device. That's really, really important for that community. But then also, on a temporary side, somebody that has an ear infection and they can't hear, right? So that's something that, again, is served by captions in a temporary way. Situational. Many of us, probably all of us, have been inside of an airport, and in the airport you have the news playing typically. Well, they don't usually have the audio of that television playing. What they do is they turn on the captions. And so you can actually sit there and read it as it's going along. And so that enables that use case that otherwise would not be effective. And then finally, on the preferential side, you have a device where, you know what, the type of device I have doesn't have a speaker, but I still want to interact with that device. So how am I going to do that? Well, I can use captions, and I'll show the example of that actually very specifically a little bit later in this presentation. And that's the device I'm talking about right there. You have Fitbit Versa 2. This was a product that was released in, worldwide release, in the fall of last year. And specifically, it is a wearable device, and that wearable device has the ability to show you your health monitoring and other kinds of information. But what they did was they also added the ability to interact with Alexa. The problem with that device, in terms of, let's say, the challenge, was that the device itself did not have a speaker on it. And it was low bandwidth between the device itself and the host application running on the mobile phone. So these constraints made it so that, yes, you could talk to it because it had a microphone, but you couldn't actually get effectively the voice interactions back from Alexa. But they wanted to make it so that people could use Alexa. You want to be able to tap the button and see the weather or set a timer or do any number of things like that. So what we came up with, and I personally was involved in this work, was, hey, we know that Alexa is typically something that somebody speaks to and then you get audio back. But in this particular use case, we realized that if we enabled captions on the audio, the voice output, then the actual device could simply just show that text instead of playing the audio in response to the voice. And that would enable this entirely new use case. And that is an example of how we've taken a accessibility feature that was built into Alexa. So those of you who are familiar, it's part of the speech synthesizer and also part of audio player. Those various audio outputs have a captions field that you can enable, and you can actually go ahead and get those captions. And so this was an innovative way to use that feature to be able to address this particularly unaddressed use case, which of course is preferential, but is a major step forward in terms of usability. So we talked about captions. Let's talk a little bit about touch input. So if I'm looking at touch input modalities, the kind of permanent use case that would be useful in this is someone who is either nonverbal, that is to say they can't speak, so they have no ability to actually voice the kind of vocalization that might be needed, or they have a cognitive impairment. Maybe they can't remember what to say. It's not an unusual thing, especially as people get older. The specific thing to say to get the agent to do what you want is not always easy to remember. Or it's basically the level of interaction is something that if they read it, they can see it and then understand it, as opposed to having to be able to process like a conversation. So that's kind of a permanent example of that accessibility in these two different categories. But focusing on the vocal side, on somebody on a temporary one is somebody has laryngitis. They just lose their voice, right, from either sickness or overuse or whatever. So they need to have some other way of interacting. This could be especially important if I have a smart home that's set up with my vocal interactions, but suddenly I can't use my voice. How am I going to turn on my lights? Need to have another way to turn on my lights, right? So I have to think about this use case. Another one, situational. You're in bed, sleeping with your significant other. So you're there and you need to do some interaction, but maybe you need to set the alarm or find out tomorrow's weather or something like this. But you don't want to use your voice because then you'll wake them up. And that probably wouldn't be a good result, I think. So that's kind of the situational example. Or if you're looking at a preferential, it's simply that I want to create a way of having an easy one-touch way of doing maybe multiple interactions, or an interaction I do often that I just prefer to reach out and do it as opposed to using my voice. And that's something that we find is very common with voice agents overall, is that touch interactivity is something that they want, that multimodal interaction case. And so to address this need, we have a very specific feature that we've created called Tap to Alexa. And Tap to Alexa, it does exactly what I just mentioned, is that it allows you to touch or type to interact with Alexa without actually having to use your voice, without having to speak. And this creates a powerful interaction modality that actually addresses all of those needs that I had mentioned before, stacking all the way to the top, where somebody wants to be able to get the weather and maybe they can't remember exactly how to do it. Well, they just tap the weather button. Or this actually is very common, especially with older people, in the use case where we want to be able to have a visual interaction, where you want to make a video call to keep and battle loneliness, especially in the time of COVID, that the exact command to drop in on this specific person or drop in on the specific device sometimes can be a little too nitty for that person to remember exactly what it is to say. Create a button, boom, press the button, and it just works every time. So they don't have to remember that, as opposed to having a little written tablet next to their Alexa device. I see many people that actually will take notes on, okay, I need to write this down so I can say this exact thing to get it to say. Those types of things are going to go away as the natural language continues to advance. But in its current state, these kinds of things are still necessary, and so this can really address those needs. So it's a powerful feature to be able to allow interaction with that kind of touch interaction as opposed to with voice. So that can be addressing all those levels of needs we mentioned. And then if we talk about mobility as a use case, right? So you look at the need of somebody that has some kind of mobility challenge. If you go ahead and look up the types of barriers that are there, a permanent mobility barrier would be somebody that suffers from paralysis. They're some kind of quadriplegic. They've suffered a neck injury or some spinal injury that means they can no longer walk, or they're paralyzed from some other illness and they can't walk. That's a permanent need that somebody would have. Or you have somebody who's in a temporary, you're recovering from surgery. So I just had surgery and I'm not allowed to or should not walk or cannot walk. So I'm in a wheelchair. And so that's a temporary situation. Or situational. I'm a senior and I can move around pretty well, but I'm in an airport and I need to get to a gate in a certain period of time. Well, that's very situational. So it would be helpful to be able to have assistance in getting there. Or, I'm a able-bodied person without an identified accessibility need, and I just rather not walk. I just rather not walk, or I don't know exactly how to get through this complicated shopping facility, so I don't want to bother to get a map, but I do want to go and get to my favorite store. And so all of these are potential needs that can be solved by a self-driving vehicle of some kind that has the ability to set the destination and interaction by your voice. And that's specifically what a company in Italy called Alba Robot is working on. They have a wheelchair conversion kit that they're working on that is also powered by Alexa. And that will specifically allow you to simply get into the chair, for example, if it's put into a hospital, and say, Alexa, ask Alba to take me to X-ray, and it will go ahead and start driving and automated with automated driving solution. It'll get you there, go through the elevators, and boom, get you exactly where you need to be to your X-ray appointment or to the pharmacy or wherever it is. This can be very empowering for somebody who's in that kind of a situation, as well as it reduce costs for the hospital itself. And so that's a very powerful mechanism. And this use case can be expanded to outside. It can be expanded to in home for people with permanent mobility issues. It can also be something that can be put into not only hospitals, but also into airports and malls and things like this. So it really creates this kind of a flexible platform that you can use your voice very naturally to get to where you want to go. And it serves all of these types of accessibility needs, whether it's permanent, whether it is temporary, whether it is situational, whether it is preferential. So it's a really powerful system that has been created right now. And so I've gone through some examples of, first of all, what do we mean when we say accessibility? What types of accessibility are there? What are the categories of accessibility? And then giving some examples of how those have been addressed in the marketplace as maybe an inspiration of how we can go ahead and solve that. And so as I started, I will also conclude, what are the key things we need to remember here? First of all, accessibility is removing barriers. And if you remove barriers, that increases access for everyone. It's not about them. It's about removing barriers. And if you remove barriers, that increases the value of your product according to those expansive categories that I talked about. And if you're designing for inclusivity, if you're designing for accessibility needs, do that from the start. Don't make it an afterthought, because if it's core in the way that you're developing the product, you're going to find that the solution is going to be more comprehensive and it's going to be more effective than if I created this thing that's really good for a 20 something person, and then all of a sudden, like, oh shoot, I need to remember like this use case of this person who doesn't have good vision, right? And so I've got to go back and retrofit everything. That's going to create essentially a Frankenstein potentially, right? You're bolting things together in a way that's not going to be natural and it's not going to be as effective. Do it from the start. And when you're doing it from the start, have a specific customer in mind. Don't create an idealized customer. Find a real person. Understand the needs of that person. Have that person test out your solution. And if you do that, you're going to come up with a solution that's actually going to be usable. And you can work outwards from that one person, but you start with the needs of that person and do it well. And finally, I want to restate that the only reason why we're even talking about this is because courageous people stood up and made the case that, look, this is not something that we can ignore and we need to address. And so people like Judith Heumann and others, we owe them a lot. And so we want to say thank you to those people, because they're awesome and they really have shown us a better way. So that is my talk for today, and I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. I hope you have a great rest of your developer experience.